Welcome back to the Closure House. I'm your host, Jessica. And in this episode, John opens up about his journey through estrangement, religious struggles, the battle with alcoholism, and creating his own identity. His story is one of resilience and transformation, showing that even in the hardest chapters, healing and freedom are possible. So, John, thank you so much for being with me today. Tell me a little bit about what led to you going no contact.
A lot of things, but I would say the biggest thing that led to no contact in general on and off over the years was a high level of control and expectations on my time, my being, my actions. It was my mom, I was an only child, grew up in a controlling religious household, and it was just my parents, and then my mom's parents lived with us as well. Plus, I was homeschooled. So there was no other real gauge on what being a kid was other than what I knew. And, my mom, there was a lot of tragic events that kind of led up to even me being born. So my mom really put her everything into me to the point of, it was more of me being a outcome of hers versus me growing up to be my own person. So anytime I showed any kind of autonomy, that was backlashed as disobedience, going against house and God. There was sin and real consequences attached to that then as I became older and kind of realized I didn't have to answer the phone when she called me 25 times in a row. I didn't have to be fully accountable for all these things. And then over time kind of started that deconstruction process from the religion and then realizing that so much of what I knew growing up was a facade, that I didn't owe them my time and personhood.
Yeah, one of the things that I'd like to understand more too is like her putting everything into you and then you being a reflection of like who she wants you to be versus like who you actually are.
Sure. So I think a couple years before I was born, my parents had another child. He died after 24 hours. My mom basically couldn't bear children very well. So when I came along, then they knew there was an issue and they had a doctor involved and everything else. So she ended up being in the hospital for like 9 weeks on her back up to the point where I was born. 9 months after I was born, which I made it, everything was fine. I was still premature. There was still underdevelopment, stuff like that. But, I was alive. 9 months after I was born, on Thanksgiving Eve, we were living in Houston at the time, and a drunk driver did a U-turn in front of us on the freeway, and my mom was pregnant at the time, and she lost a child in the accident. I came out fine, but, she almost lost her life, and basically my dad gave me to some strangers on the side of the road just to have somewhere to send me, and she was in the hospital for a while. There was a lot of separation there, and basically during that time, she gave her life to God. She was already raised, Christian, kind of in a cult already, so she was already at that mindset, and she just kind of went full into it. So then in the process, she also dedicated my life to God, which was, pretty much, I had the quote unquote free will within that, to, if I wanted to be a doctor or whatever, but, essentially it was no matter what, you're going to, preach the word of God, and whatever you do for the glory of God to get other people to them, because basically we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for God. So therefore, your entire life is projected into that. So everything was very dogmatic, very by the book. It was room checks. It was anything that everything was spiritual warfare.
Mm-hmm.
I would wake up 2 a.m. She'd be in my room because she thought that there was an angel and demon having literal warfare in my room at the time. When I got into my teen years, obviously, I grew up in the Seattle area during the 90s, so music was a huge part of the culture. And when I found that, when I kind of got outside of the household and I found that, and it was like I felt alive. It just felt like I could be me when I listened to that kind of music and stuff. But when she would find, she would quote unquote be cleaning my room, and then all of a sudden, my stuff would disappear. And in her mind, she was protecting me from all these things. But in actuality, it was this is the path that you're going to lead because I set that for you versus me being able to find my own way and be my own person.
Yeah, when you're growing up that way, it's like anything you do, if it's not for God, then it's like against God, instead of it
Yes.
just being like you listening to secular music and finding your place there.
Well, and that included, and I would say this is where the key came in with not knowing what a boundary was until, I could say months ago, really. I'm 45 years old now. But, obedience was the goal of perfection in a child. So critical thinking of that was rebellion. Saying no to something was a sin. There was no, it was this is the music you're going to listen to. This is the haircut you're going to have. The particular religion I grew up in, it was, from Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown. There was no secular activities. So anything, like I got into cycling when I was a young teen and I was really good at it. And it was like one of the first times that and the music, even now, now that I'm 45, cycling and music are my life. Like that's what makes me alive on my own. But I couldn't pursue those things because so many of the rides and races and stuff like that were on Saturday. So I couldn't do that. It was the 80s and 90s. So there was a lot of this generational idea of kids that was instilled that you're gifted and you can do anything and you're special and the whole world is your oyster as long as you do exactly what we want with it.
Right. It's that control, though. It's not you formulating your own life and walking your path. It's you walking the path that they're paving for you.
Correct. Yeah. And if you go outside of that, then it's disobedience, it's sin, it's going against them in any way, shape, or form is also going against God. And I think compounding that, was even before the accident. And then, we moved from Houston to Seattle. And then, at that time, and then also like in the mid 80s, my dad had a couple areas of infidelity. And then there was a point in the late 80s, early 90s where my mom is very proud of the fact and has told everybody that, married Jesus at that point. The problem with that, of course, is that Jesus is a physical being in front of you. So she still had to have that registration, that representation of a surrogate spouse, in fact. So that became me. I became that role. So even now, I'm talking like a month ago when I bring these things forward, attempting to, have these conversations, then it immediately turns into how she was abused, how things happened to her, how my dad was, such a terrible person, blah, 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 blah. And it never centers on my experience. It centers on her experience in that victimhood versus, her role in that. And I'm not looking even for an apology. I'm not looking for I don't want her to feel bad about it. Like, I don't think she did any of these things out of spite or ill will. I think she did all of it out of what she knew was best and needed and the right thing to do from the control tactics that were used on her, again, within the same religion. Like, we're like fifth, sixth generation. So, I mean, it's all there. But when she gets to that point, it's so enmeshed in her that it's impossible for her to take down that shield and be able to be like, oh, that's how that affected you. It never gets to that point.
I also wanted to know if anything else stood out to you, like things that actually happened. Like, I understand the secular music thing. I was raised this very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like you're hiding the music because it's like the only thing
100%.
you can grasp onto, right?
Yep.
But did anything else stand out where she was like really controlling or any kind of like abuse?
It was a combination of super control in those areas with basically an unsafe hands off in others. And again, this is kind of that, Gen X kid lifestyle. I think that some people just chalk it up to this is the way things were, but it was a very big contrast where, when it came to the music or friends or, TV shows, anything and everything was satanic and demonic or whatever else. So there was a high level of control, but it never translated in my mind to being equated with a safety thing because, she would be gone for hours on end, leave me home alone. Again, I was an only child. Young, I would roam free through the neighborhood, get miles away from the house, just walking or riding my bike or whatever at 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. She became an Avon lady for a while. and she used that as a tool to evangelize door to door, but then would take me with her as kind of the in as, oh, I've got this kid, so I'm trustworthy kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
If I wrecked my bike or something, it was 99% concern of how much this was going to cost them or be an inconvenience for them versus are you okay? And I think that are you okay part hits in my mind because, like at 8 years old or so, I was from a member of our church who was this significant member of the church. And, it took me 4 years to actually come out with that because I didn't feel safe saying it because anything that was impure in the house was immediately rejected, So I just, in my mind, that was going to come along with it. So, I developed insomnia issues, chronic migraines, no will to really be involved with anything. And even now, even recently, my mom has said, well, I saw you getting depressed and we wanted to get you some help, but, dad didn't want to spend the money. And again, it's like, you could have talked, like it didn't take therapy or whatever else. It was more just like show some legit concern and ask questions. Right. But even when all that finally came out, then immediately, everything, again, nothing centered on me in that situation. It centered on, the perpetrator and their family and the protection of the church. And that pattern has escalated and repeated itself over the years, where anytime that there's a serious concern that I have or issue around me, it becomes immediately centric on the image of her and the church, and the religion and everything else. It's, it did out of that, all of that after 4 years of managing that, internally as a 8 to 12-year-old, when there are much bigger things to worry about in life that should be, at the end of all that, it was, I vividly remember basically just being on the outskirts of the living room as they're having these conversations with all the church people and everything else, and just being like a, onlooker to a TV show. And then kind of after all that happening, someone, maybe my dad, but I don't remember. But anyway, someone casually kind of glancing down at me and going, are you okay? Do you need to talk to somebody? And of course, I'm going, no,
right?
I don't want to
trust anyone.
Yeah, that sounds scary. And that was the end of it, and that's the last I heard of it. So it's those patterns, and that came up again recently, where, because of that, I had a lot of suicidal ideation over the decades. I never, it was like I was constantly trying to put my cogs into other people's wheels, trying to make a fit, and of course that never worked. And so I never felt like me. And, one of the things that always kind of kept me from it was that, being religious, and I always grew up understanding that it was one of those things where if you, basically if you committed, you were going against the Holy Spirit and God, and that was separating you from God. So it was pretty much a direct line to hell, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I brought this up to my mom a couple of years ago, and she immediately went into, no, that's not what we believe. That we can't say if they're, if someone like that is going to go to hell or not, blah, blah, blah. She starts expounding on all the, the church beliefs around that. Not once did she say, are you okay now? Why were you feeling that? What caused that? Again, it all came back around to how to protect the image of the religion and her and everything around that.
Yeah. And it, one of the things that keeps standing out, even after the accident, your dad like handing you to strangers, because I understand there was something happening. She had to go to the hospital, right. But so much of it feels like not being cared about. It's like nobody's asking about how you're feeling. Are you okay? You crash a bike. It's like, this is going to cost us money, right. Instead of it being like, we care about you and you're more important than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, that's again, it's, they care as long as I was working in the progression or something they could be proud of, they could brag about, it was more like having a show dog or I don't even know what it is, but it wasn't a kid. Like, and one of the things that stood out to me, since I've got engaged in these conversations and learned more and read books and everything else, because I pretty much had to find my way here, is that a very small portion of your child's life is them as a kid. They're essentially an autonomous adult the majority of their time, and there's a very short time where you have that responsibility to them, and instead it was 100% me having a responsibility to them.
Right.
if I had, one of the things that really brought me again to this point of being able to have, and I don't even say no contact or low contact in terms of communication, just in terms of how I relate myself to my parents in terms of that level of care. Because, I mean, up until a couple of years ago, it always felt like I would never have any kind of autonomy until they were dead, essentially.
Hmm.
And so, being able to remove myself from that obligation to how they feel about me and how what I'm doing affects them, all that really made a more significant difference. But a lot of what brought me to that was, basically over the last couple of years, realizing a diagnosis of autism, and then backtracking and understanding how many things that affected our relationship even as far back as I can remember, 4, 5, 6 years old. I didn't cope well in public situations.
Right.
So anytime that I was in a public scenario, then those things would come out. And, or, if I was pushed into a place where I had no out because I couldn't say no, I couldn't set a boundary, I was just forced to do something, that demand avoidance would pop up. And there was just, there was no way forward. So, I mean, at a young age, my only out was having a meltdown, essentially. And my mom to this day is very proud of the fact that anytime, she's like, well, he only had that 2 or 3 times because I would just leave the room or leave the house, and he just had to depend on himself until he got over it. So when you have an autistic child having a meltdown and the response is abandon, essentially,
Right.
then there's no safe zone for that. So, and even now, instead of being able to process through that, it's just that I leave. I just run away to a corner and hide. And
Right. And, looking back at it, it's neglect. And
yeah,
I think that's the part that makes it so hard when you're talking to parents, whether you're estranged or not, low contact, like you said, no contact, whatever. When you're talking to them, you're like, you did this to me. This hurt me. I needed this from you. And they're like, I did nothing wrong. It's almost like they believe these are new terms or new things that are being conditioned into people instead of
right.
realizing, like, you left your child when they were having a breakdown instead of modeling how to handle a breakdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you hit on something there with, with that community is, especially now with social media, you have a select few who are, I think, at the opposite end of, they're at the full stop end of not having any self-reflection, and in fact putting themselves out there and being proud of the fact of who they are. And I think that kind of silences or emboldens some of the people that would have, some of the parents that would have more concern of, or some self-reflection of, maybe I didn't do right. But, there's so much ego built up in this. And I think that's the hard part when you're having these conversations in any debate, right? Like when your self-image is completely wrapped up in who this person you are. Like, with my mom, her entire 99% of her being is getting to heaven and getting other people there in the way that she is indoctrinated to know how. And, I started that deconstruction process at 26 years old and went through all that with her. Because, I mean, again, this is a huge part of it, the religion aspect of it. And I don't have anything, my wife, my kids are religious. My issue isn't with religion, full stop. My issue is with the amount of control that happens, especially within, like, what I was raised in, with very apocalyptic, prophetic style of any given time around any corner, anything can be interpreted as bringing on the end times of, then Jesus is going to come back. But first, all these things are going to happen where you're going to have to, run to the mountains, and, you're going to be imprisoned, and you're going to have to defend your faith in a court of law. Again, being an autistic child, having this drilled into you from before you could speak. I mean, this was practically my entire life. It was not, there was no goals in growing up. There was no goals in meeting a girl. There was no goals in having a family or driving a car or saving money or building a life. It was, none of that is important because Jesus is going to come back before you can do any of those things. And then attached to that is then the perfectionism that goes with it. It was, clean your room. Okay. my room is cleaned. And then it was an inspection, and it was, 99% of the time, it was never enough, no matter what you did. 100% of the time, it did not matter. Like, looking back on it, I'm like, especially, looking at my kids' rooms, whatever, I was like, man, my room was spotless. But,
Right.
it was this level of perfection that, again, there was no point, long-term and short-term goal setting was completely out the window because it was never good enough. So why set a goal if you can never reach it? Ironically, they have their savings accounts, they have their retirement, they have their life that they wanted to build. Somehow they did that, but that was never in the cards for me. And even now, it's very difficult to set any kind of goals or boundaries in that regard, just because my brain is so conditioned to see against that.
Right. And then it's like it challenges your faith. So no matter how much you try to deconstruct the religious upbringing, when it's used for control, it makes it so hard for you to determine your identity. So then
Yeah,
you have to go against what you believe about yourself, what's right by the Bible and, biblically and the Holy Spirit. Then you have to try to figure out, who am I now? Who do I want to be? All while not ever having planned for the future, because
right.
the future wasn't even going to occur.
Exactly. The future wasn't going to happen, so there was no point. And of course, then life kept happening and events kept happening and everything else. But, and I guess, in all this, I also had a very, how I always felt that deep down, my parents really loved me. They really cared about me. And, uh, and there's that part of being a kid and knowing that, hey, I need someone to go to if catastrophe happens, if I can't, and it's funny because you see so many people going, well, they're more willing to come back for money. Well, because that's the only thing they feel like that's the last thing that is really keeping them attached to you. And yeah, it's not right, but you're doing it too. Like,
Mhm.
better than him at something that was immediately swapped back. So it was like when we moved from Seattle to Nashville when I was 19 years old, and I definitely did not want to move. And again, looking back now, knowing that I was autistic, everything else, like building that life was impossibly hard as a teenager. It was much more difficult past that point, when you didn't have those connections growing up. And so having that dramatic move at, 19 years old when I did not want to move, I had no desire to leave. And then 6 months into that, things didn't work out. And so then my parents moved to Louisville and basically just left me in Nashville. And there was just no, do you want to move with us or do you want to stay here? We'll help you, blah, blah, blah. Like, it was just like, you're staying here now and we're going to go there. And so, I mean, it was almost like they went no contact with me first to a certain degree because they just left, right? And then, a few years later, then my dad just couldn't do this job without me. He wanted, because we had worked together before, so then he wanted to hire me back, and I was like, okay. And that was like after 9/11 happened and all that, so then the economy was kind of crashing, so moved up to Louisville with them, and then got married. My wife was pregnant with our twins, and months after we got married, we just found out maybe a week or two beforehand that she was pregnant with twins, and then he fired me without cause. So we ended up moving back where my wife is from, just because, so we'd have some kind of support network. We were 24, 25 years old, time with twins coming. It was a lot, to think through.
Yeah.
So we moved, a couple hours away. I got a job doing the same thing I was doing before, same thing he does. And then over time, I worked up, I became general manager of that plant. So we were both general managers of competing companies, basically, but we were cooperative, as far as like, if I needed overrun stuff, I'd buy it from him, whatever. So we were in contact and everything was good. But then the owner of the company that I worked for, who I was pretty close with, and, he was like, yeah, your dad talked to me the other night and he's basically trying to get your job. He wanted me to hire him.
Whoa.
Yeah. And my dad had a job, again, doing this for years, the job that he fired me from, and then basically tried to come in and, and tried to work his way in to basically take my job from me, because he saw the grass was greener. He saw that I had a good relationship with the owner. I had a lot more autonomy than he did. Like, I had all the things that he expected to have. So
Right.
then, he wanted that for him. And this again, it was just this pattern over and over again. When I was like 12 years old, he was we were working in the garage on our bikes, whatever. And he was like, I like you now that you're older. You're fun now. And I was like, well, where was I for the past decade? Like,
Right.
even then it wasn't a compliment, it was who was I before? And so it's these, things over and over again with the family dynamics. And it was when I was a couple of years ago, and where this all kind of came together was a couple of years ago. My cousin passed away, and her and I were a week apart in age. So, it was very much like she was definitely like, in terms of blood proximity, she was my closest relative. She was pretty much the only relative I spoke with at all. And she had, she had her similar issues with her parents. She definitely didn't like my parents at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so, she was one of the few people in the world that I could talk to and kind of understood my perspective, because I can't say that there was, until I kind of found these communities online of, people who've gone through the same thing. I thought that I was the only person on earth that did not like my mother, Anyway, she passed away. She was 43 years old, and she from alcoholism. And so, I mean, immediately I was making arrangements to fly out to the funeral and everything else. And I even purposefully did not say anything about it. I mean, like, of course my parents knew that this happened and everything else, but I purposely just left it out until I was already had the plane tickets. I was basically at the airport, and I was like, yeah, I'm headed there now, because I knew it would happen, which is exactly what happened. They did not go to the funeral. I mean, this is my dad's sister, his niece, who, again, he was there for her graduation. He flew out there for her graduation, did all these things. Even months before, he had driven 2,000 miles back here to go to a funeral of a guy that he went to church with. But then, didn't make the effort at all to go there, and then claimed that they sent me to go. It's like, you didn't pay for it, you didn't make these decisions, like, you had nothing to do with it. So anyway, I get out there, and I was right in the middle of really questioning these things, and I'd gone to therapy some, but my autism and demand avoidance did not like traditional, like, the therapy thing at all. So that didn't last long. But I'd already kind of been going through like this discovery of the autism of trying to just figure things out. I also, through those years, had a pretty severe alcohol abuse problem of my own. And so I go out there and I see kind of a reflection of, the path that I'm on, happening in front of me. And then, I was already looking for a lot of the autistic cues, because they come up in my mind that my dad's mom was autistic, and that's where it kind of started. It wasn't even on me, it was on that. And then I started tracing things through, and I was like, oh wait, it's me, I'm that. But I get out there, and then I had always been sheltered from my dad's side of the family. My mom didn't like his mom, he didn't like his mom, he didn't like his sisters. Like, it was a whole, they'd gone no contact with that whole side of the family before I ever went no contact. So I get out there, and it's like, oh, these are like cool, normal, regular people. Like, these are the first time I've actually knew I had a family that wasn't crazy. And so, we're hanging out talking, and I'm like, man, there's a lot of neurodivergence here. I can see it all. It's everywhere. Like, this is where it is. This is where it's coming from. I can see it now. And then with my cousin going down the path, and she had multiple DUIs, everything else. So I was lucky to be able to avoid a lot of that. But it was just, again, I saw so much reflection that really woke me up to things. And then, like, at one point, one of my aunts, because both my dad's sisters were, there, and we were able to just talk for a long time. And, one of them was like, well, yeah, if we had ever got invited to your wedding. And I was like, what do you mean invited to my wedding? Because we had given my mom a stack of invites, because we didn't have access to any of the addresses or anything. She had her address book. So we were like, here's the invites. We don't have access to the stuff. You can take care of this. And she's, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. She, put on the happy face, and she was going to do it. She didn't invite a single person to my wedding. So, like, the only people that were at my wedding were my parents and my grandparents. Even my grandparents I grew up with for 20 years weren't there. So, like, literally, and I was kind of just showed up to my wedding going, well, I guess I'm it.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around that. You thinking that, okay, nobody's here, nobody is attending, when in reality, she didn't even invite them.
Correct. So there was no gifts sent, because they found out after the fact. They basically found out that I was married after I was married. So then it turned into looking like it was a big hidden conspiracy theory, especially when we had honeymoon babies. So we had twins, 9 months, literally 9 months after we were married. And it wasn't that. We had been planning for 2 years to get married. But yeah, it she basically turned into a conspiracy because it looked like we were hiding things. There was no Facebook then. There was no social media. So there was no way for me to contact these people. I didn't have their emails.
And you didn't think you had to, is one of the clearest things, right? It's like she's responsible for it. She's a part of this. It's a way for her to help you.
Right.
Getting married, even the religious aspect of that, like that should have been the, like, everybody showing up. This would have been their time to shine kind of thing.
Well, but that was part of it, right? So I was raised in a very anti-Catholic religion. I married Catholic. So that was a major part of it. In fact, I had never, like, my mom had me so enmeshed, and I will go as far as, emotional incest with me, because like I said, I kind of became the surrogate partner for her when, she's kind of, instead of leaving my dad, she left my dad emotionally.
Right. And then you had to take on that emotional baggage. And I'm very curious as to, like, how did that part impact you?
I mean, it always has. And because, again, I saw it as, it's like any abusive situation. You see it as love. They see it as love. You see it as love. So when I see moms, on TikTok, it especially enrages me when they're like, oh, I had such a loving, the words they use with their sons in particular. And then when their sons go non-contact, and all the phrasing they use is the same phrasing you would use with an ex, that you were in a voluntary relationship that was truly equal, but a parent to a child is never an equal, there's never an equal. We didn't voluntarily enter this relationship.
Right.
So we were, expected to be there. And so again, I never saw it as that, but through that, any female was competition for her. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I didn't, again, everything turned into being secretive. She never knew I had a girlfriend until she met my wife.
Yeah.
And, that was when I was 23 years old. So she never knew I had a girlfriend until I was 23. So, it, to me, in my mind, is like, well, this is the girl I'm bringing home. So it's obviously pretty serious. She saw as, oh, this is his first girlfriend, And right. So in her mind, I think she was like, if she pacifies this long enough, and if she's nice enough, whatever else, then it'll go away. This is just and for me, it was a huge step for me to bring someone home. Of course, she never saw that because she never asked, why aren't you dating? Why aren't you bringing a girl home? What's going on in your life? There was never any curiosity there. It was just like, oh, well, I don't have anything to compete against, so that's good.
Right.
And so it created a very unhealthy dynamic as in terms of secrecy for me, where I've never, and because of my, dad and being so ingrained in me how terrible he was and everything else, it's never even entered my brain to cheat, But that suspicion is always there because I always look suspicious because I've always been so secretive about those things. And so many things, like this is where kind of the autism comes in too. Like, I don't want to be seen. I don't want to be observed. I don't want to be, so it's one of those things where keeping all that so low down, but then all the imagined scenarios of bringing home, a girl. And when I do, then, also my mom was so purity based and everything else. So my wife had already had a child and adopted her out, there was a lot of things that came to light. But again, as this process happened, my mom was very accepting of it, everything else. And I think it was just if I accept it and I'm okay with it, then it'll go away. And then, I was talking to her about the time I was proposing to my wife. And I specifically remember she was like on the floor reading a book, as she always is. And, she's kind of faced into her study where she was reading. And I was talking, and she never, she wasn't acknowledging me through this whole conversation. I was just kind of talking to air. And then just mid sentence, she turns around, she looks up at me, and she's like, oh, you love her. And it was just like an accusation, and so then, we got married, had kids, and then, it was like, okay, we got to figure out what, how we're going to raise these kids, because obviously, my religion is anti-Catholic. My wife is Catholic. And my wife was like, hey, whatever we need to do, we just need to be on the same page. So I went, RCIA for Catholicism, basically to debunk it and go, okay, this is why I'm not becoming Catholic. And then I became Catholic. And most of that wasn't because I necessarily believed in the Catholicism 100%, it was because the fascia that my mom had created was destroyed so quickly. Again, from as long as I can remember, we were supposed to be running to the woods and defending our faith and going to prison for it. And by the way, I still am afraid of going to prison. Like, it's still a thing where, like, if I have, like, I've with business or whatever else, like, I've gone through a couple tax audits, this and that, and I'm just convinced I'm going to be in prison for the rest of my life,
Yeah.
And so this whole thing was based on defending your faith in a court of law. Then I went straight to my mom because she was the best religious person, in that regard. She knew more than anybody else I knew. She was the most, studied on this thing. So, I went to her on it, and it was like pretty basic critical arguments, and it just immediately, again, one was, it was never centered on concern about me. It was immediately defending her faith to me. So then I became the enemy. And so then when she, every one of her arguments pretty much turned into, well, that's just the way I believe. And that's fine, but that's not defendable in a court of law.
No.
You know what I mean?
You can't. That's the biggest problem that I have with it. Like, being raised in a similar way,
Yeah.
it's like you can't even ask questions.
Right.
It's like they want you to believe this blindly, and then they
Yes.
question your faith if you don't, right? But if you have a question about it, like, hey, why is this way, or why does the Bible say this or that, they will not answer or cannot. It's just like, what you're doing is wrong, just even questioning it.
Right. And again, it was one of those things where it was so quick. It was this thing in my mind that my parents had my back and they loved me. And then every time things progressively happened, it was, they don't have my back. They have the back of their religion. And so, when it was finally like, well, I converted to Catholicism, when I was 27. And then, when my mom finally realized that she had lost the battle and that, I was going to become Catholic, and then she immediately, it became spiteful, and she said, so when the time of trouble happens, because their whole premise is based on the Catholics being, the bad guy.
Mhm.
So, part of this is that the Catholics are going to persecute them because of the way they believe. So she literally asked me, and I don't even want to like quote it because it's difficult, but she basically, paraphrasing, she immediately asked me at that point if, when the time of trouble came, if I would her for her belief, because, I was Catholic now. Like, there was as much mind control on what, the other side, that now I'm going to my mom because she believes different. It's like, I don't care how you believe. I care that you care how I believe,
Yeah.
And so, and this, happened again where a couple years ago, my mom's sister, my aunt, what's funny is, like, I always had in my mind, because she has a lot of mental issues, and again, I'm not disparaging her in any way, shape, or form, but I mean, that was how I knew her whole life. She was always on disability and everything else. She couldn't hold a job, but a great, like, she was always fun to be around. She was always she listened to the best music. Her kids were fun. Like, I hadn't been in contact with them for years, but in my mind, I had that version of her in my head, and I always thought, man, if we could talk now, she would still have my back, because, she did the same thing. Right? She went no contact. She moved to California, she moved across the world. She focused on her family, her dynamic, and she kind of just left. She left the religion. She left everything. She did that at like 18 years old. It was like, as soon as she could get out, she was gone. And, but, my parents had moved, my grandparents who had grown up down to Kentucky, where they lived, again, against their will, against my grandparents' will. And I think it was just it's like they need these safety blankets. These aren't humans to them. They're their safety blankets. So they moved my grandparents down to Kentucky, again, pretty much against their will, same as I did. And then my grandpa died, and then my grandma was in hospice. Well, then my parents, around COVID, decided that they were going to move back to Washington State and be missionaries, essentially, is what they said. Basically, they just live on the side of a mountain. But and it was funny because they came to our house. They lived an hour, two and a half hours away. They came to my house like once or twice a year. So it was a big deal when they came, and they like, we have something to tell you. And my wife was pretty much like, oh, they're going to move here. That was the dread that they were going to move, to where I am.
Yeah.
And then they decided nope, we're moving 2,000 miles away because we're going to be missionaries. So anyway, when they did that, they left my grandma behind in Kentucky, like,
What?
with no, yeah. So she was still alive in hospice. And then they left her behind there. She's 2.5 hours away from me. Like, I couldn't even really take care of her. And then she was like breaking bones all the time because she just was basically being neglected and abused. And, there was nothing I could really do about it. But it was just like they left her there. Well, then during some of these conversations, like around the time my cousin died, because that's right when I started hitting my mom, it really struck me that you didn't care enough to go to a funeral for a day, when this happened, like, and the parallels were clear. Like, would you care if I died? Like, because it was, I would say in the patterns that I was in at the time, I was months away from that myself at the time. It was, so for me, it was very real. It was like, I feel like I'm right there too. Yeah. And that was when it became clear that no, you don't, because that was also when I had the, conversation about the suicide, and she was basically just divided in the faith. There was no concern about me, and in many ways, looking on it now, I feel like, if something happened to me in that regard, it would be just as much of a positive for them, because that would be part of their story. They'd be something to get that sympathy card that they want. But anyway, so in the middle of all this, and I was in, and this is where, again, when we have these discussions with estranged parents on social media and stuff, it angers me because, they're like, well, they just went silent, or, they accused me of all these things, and they,
Right.
they said all these things about me, and this was wrong, and this is wrong. It's like, they're kids. They're trying to figure out they're trying to figure out what is wrong. They know something is wrong, and they're just trying to find it. Like, either they're trying not to hurt your feelings by just going silent, or they're on the other side and they just don't know what to say, and they're just trying to find the language until it fits to where it clicks, to where you can find that repair, because without confronting it, you're never going to get there. And so I made the cardinal sin at one point of telling, and I wrapped it very carefully, because I always thought growing up that my dad was a narcissist, and in reality, I think he was just neurodivergent like me, and he just did things imperfectly. But my best conclusion I could come up to, which was still protecting my mom as much as I could, was that his narcissism, she kind of reflected with going through the wreck and going through, a lot of TBI and everything else, and that, she kind of had to reconstruct herself. So she kind of reflected his personality into hers. So in my mind, she was like a normal, good human being at her core, but she kind of had put a shell on her of narcissism, like an M&M. So that was the best explanation I can come up with. And, at the point when everything went down with my cousin, it didn't matter to me anymore, because it was like, they're no longer, I realized that they were no longer a safe spot for me to go. There was no more, well, what if I have a catastrophe or whatever else? It didn't matter to me anymore. If I had a catastrophe, I'll figure it out. I don't need them to figure it out,
Yeah.
And so at that point, I gave her my theory, basically, that, hey, because every time I would bring up anything, it was how bad my dad was. So that was her whole personality, was that she was the way she was because of my dad, the way he was. And I was like, okay, well, let's roll that out. This is how that looks if you put this into words. And, I feel that you kind of, wrapped yourself in this narcissistic blanket to protect yourself. And it wasn't like you are a narcissist, but I said the word narcissism, Well, Christmas time rolled around, and this was right after my cousin died. And I got a Christmas card from my aunt, my mom's sister. And again, my entire life I had, had this idea that she would be on my side if we could have a conversation about it. And my mom and her never got along. Like my whole growing up, like they would tolerate each other, but they weren't friends. My mom always tried to preach to her, and my aunt was very anti-religion, and she cussed all the time and everything else. So it was just she was just her own person. And so my wife is going through the mail, and, I saw the card, Christmas card from my aunt, whatever. And I was like, okay, cool. And there was a letter inside of it. And, I just figured it was hey, this is what this kid did and that kid did. And the typical that era of people sending Christmas cards, as far as, catching everybody up on the family. And my wife turns around at me and she's like, you need to read this. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And so I kind of set it aside, and then she asked me again, like the day later, like, have you read that, note from your aunt yet? And I was like, no, it's whatever. And so then I was like, fine, I'll read it. So I start out, and it's all like, da, 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 da. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then she just goes into a rampage on me about, again, how hard things were on her and my mom, and how I called my mom a narcissist, and how my parents moved away because of me.
Whoa.
Yeah, and that they left my and all this stuff. And it was funny, like she's going on all this, basically accusing me of being the person that drove my parents away and all this stuff. I didn't even live there. I lived 2.5 hours away. We saw them
Right.
twice a year. There was no like they didn't live in the house next door. That's what it sounded like when she sent this letter. And then how I need to how it's my job to fix the family, and I need to repair this with my mom and be in contact with her and do whatever it takes. And basically the end of the letter was it's I'm paraphrasing again, but it was
Mhm.
basically you need to talk to your mom. Mine is dead. And I was like,
Whoa.
I literally lived with my grandparents for my until I was 19 years old, and then I lived in their house before they did in Kentucky, and then they lived 2.5 hours away from me for the past however many years. So like, there's been 4 years maybe out of my entire life that I have not been within striking distance of my grandparents, right? And I have seen her visit 3 times in that entire time, and the third
Right.
time was after my grandma died. So I'm like, you might be feeling guilty for that yourself. That's not my guilt to I was like, whoa, that's not no. And two, all your timeline is completely off. Like
Right.
none of this is practical. But it was just all the words that she used were my mom.
And it's another time that you had to defend how you like your role in things.
Right.
Like everybody's just wanting you to be a pawn and you do whatever they say. And you are having to fight to be like, this is not okay. This doesn't feel right. That's a lot of responsibility from childhood to adulthood.
For sure. And again, it was the fact that she was basically parroting what my mom was saying. So then it was a double whammy because again, before that point, and this was 2 years ago, but up to that point, I really felt that internally, my parents had my back and I was just the bad guy, and same with my aunt. Like, hey, if we could connect, she would really appreciate my stance. And then it was like, well, I literally have, zero family at this point, and
Mhm.
yeah, and again, it's just the constant centering of self. It's like I can't think of a good analogy right now, but it's like anything where you like a pendulum or anything else. Like it's a self-centering thing where she can never recenter herself on my experience to understand what I'm saying in any way, shape, or form. It continually recenters on her, and anything that disrupts her narrative of who I am and that or that she was anything but a good parent. And again, I'm not looking for her to feel shame in being a parent. I guess
Right.
my thing was just that don't feel shame in who I am,
Yes.
and they in so many ways I feel like if my mother included, these estranged parents, when they say, well, what about them, they need to apologize too. That's the part that always comes out, and it's like, but they want us to apologize for being us.
Right. But they want us to accept them. See, they
Right.
don't want to change.
They
Right.
they want the validation of who they are without giving us the validation for.
That's it.
And like I said, there was, she has a library in her house. She reads constantly. Like I know she can read, right? And so when I was going through, figuring out the autism diagnosis and everything else, I sent her Unmasking Autism, and I know it was mostly just because like I don't remember the conversations exactly, but it was pretty much I because I was trying to get some validation from her that she saw these patterns, right?
Yeah.
And then also kind of seeing in my dad as well, like maybe he's not the terrible person you've always made him out to be, because maybe this is just kind of who he is as well in these regards, and we can work around that.
Yeah.
And because that was a huge part of, for me, the validation in, with the having the autistic diagnosis, like I could go through 98% of who I am and be able to go, autism, check. It's
Mhm.
almost a joke around the house because I would just be like, oh, yep, I did because autism. And and it's not I think part of it is that so much of, like, we're here talking now because again, I hope other people see the similarities in their own life, and hopefully can connect those dots and see the patterns that somebody else is having, have that shared experience. I'm not saying any of this as an excuse for who I was or things that I did. I was an alcoholic for a long time. That affected my family negatively for a long time. I was not a present good dad for a long time. Like, I will but I'm not saying that I was those things because of this and because, well, I was an alcoholic because of that. I made those choices myself. Like I'll own that. I'm not saying any of this is an excuse, but for her, it's an immediate, well, you saw me as this because of what happened to me. But then when it came to me, I was the one doing the errors. I was the one that was imperfect. I was the one who could just do better. It was always, well, you have the capability to be better. You can do better than that. You can clean your room better than that. You can, not with anything, you can do anything through Christ who strengthens you. That was the constant, thing. And where is he?
And it's always this, you're never enough. It's like you're
Right.
striving for something and you're never enough. And then even surviving everything you went through, it's kind of like these estranged parents on TikTok are like, well, you need to apologize. What's your responsibility? And I'm always like, what responsibility do we have as kids? I mean, some kids, they do things that are wrong, but I mean, for just being who you are, not who I could have been, but
Right,
like
exactly.
who you conditioned me to be. Like you stole the identity.
Yeah.
So like, I am so curious as to like, how did you get to this though? Like who you are today?
I mean, I think a lot of it is around that same spot where, where I was getting at before was on like the book with Unmasking Autism. Like I said, that, that was my biggest thing, was just read this.
Yeah.
And then, in my mind, I thought she would read the book and be able to go, oh, that's what he was doing when he was 5 years old, when he had a meltdown. That's what he was doing when he was, that would click for her to see the similarities. Well, in 2 years, she still hasn't read the book, she started to here and there, and she has, had her glitches, start and stops. But the only thing that she has said in that regard is that she saw my dad in that, so she recognizes autism on my dad, but then refuses it in any way, shape, or form in me. So again, any tool or story that I've used that is meant to understand me got turned into leverage for her narrative. Even now to this day, she still refuses to acknowledge that I'm autistic in any way, shape, or form, because it would disrupt her narrative on my abilities, essentially. Because again, it was, you can do anything as long as it's what we want. And so again, for me, it was that unleashing. I had no idea what, when people said, like, I went through a sobriety journey in 2019 into 2020, and it was all white knuckling, but, kind of got surrounded by, those communities and that. And I yeah, like anything, I went into 100%, and it was like, well, I'm just an alcoholic, and that's my issue, and this is all these things, and in that perspective, everything I saw was, in the alcoholism, whatever else. But then I realized that I don't want to be 60 years old and counting the days and going, oh, I'm an alcoholic, blah, 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 because I didn't feel that was my identity, because I've only felt like a normal person, quote unquote, with the alcohol. And so much of that reasoning around that time, with that narrative is, you got to find your why, why not to do it. And it was like, I didn't have a good enough why not. Like it just wasn't, it didn't matter, because I had nothing to, no matter what I did. And then, a few years ago, like 2022, 2023, in those years, like I had attained everything materially that I thought I needed for my life to feel better. I was debt free. I was making good money. Had, a local business on top of that. I was super, super involved with the church. Everybody in the community, knew who I was. I'd rebuilt what I had in Washington before I moved. I felt that, well, I can't get rid of this anxiety because I'm always worried about money. Or, there was always these worries. If these things magically went away, I would be whole. And then all those things went away within a few months, essentially. A lot of stuff clicked together, and then it was all gone. And I felt the worst I'd ever felt in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those things where, hey, I'm not having to worry about money. I have all these things. I should be able to be creative. I should be doing all these, amazing things. And all I wanted to do was just black out. That was basically it. But then when, it was really 99%, coming to the realization of the autism and understanding it took away that level of guilt. And also in that, I never understood what self-care meant, because I had nothing to self-care. My entire life was caring about other people's feelings, not mine. So it was, once I realized that, hey, I have limitations. This is why I can't do, my brain is going, because my brain has been so trained that you can do anything. that, and I've accomplished a lot, especially being as heavily influenced by autism as I am. I'm feel like I'm in the 1% in that regard of, being able to, of kind of happenstancely overcoming that. But what came with that was an extreme amount of burnout when I hit the end, when I hit the wall.
Yeah.
So when I hit that, when it was like I should have everything I want, and then I also hit that wall of burnout, and then it was like there's nothing nothing's worth it. And having the added layer again continually still at that point of the religion on top of it, and understanding, I think the biggest realization for me at that point, and I think this is whether you're autistic or not, but for me, having the label of why I did things, and understand that it's a shared experience, and there are thousands of people that are struggling the exact same way I am. It's not me being weak. It's just, my limitations, and being able to understand that and strip that away, made it to where I could introduce that self-care and know where my limitations were and when to back off and stop. And understanding that these things that happened when I was young, and how I reacted to things and how I reacted around people and all this stuff, like, again, I was and to see the benefits of what I had built over time and how I was raised as well, because it was like, and that's one thing, I'm like, hey, homeschooling, I would not have been a good student if I was in a school situation. It was always like, well, if I just got to school, I would have been more successful. Well, no, I wouldn't, because I would have been terrible at school. If I had just had siblings, that would have been better. Well, maybe, the issue of being an only child in this situation is I'm the golden child and I'm the scapegoat, right?
Yep.
So, like, no matter what you do, you're the best of times, you're the worst of times. There's no out. Like, you're the best kid and the worst kid. So no matter what, they have to fit that narrative all into one person. So that becomes, but being able to go back and again, realize all these things. So spinning that back to the sobriety part of it, it became almost instantaneously, like, I wasn't having to white knuckle anything. I mean, I haven't touched a drop of alcohol in 600 plus days. Like, it was an immediate realizing why I did it instead of why not to do it.
That's amazing. I feel like that's alone is going to help so many people. One of the things that I notice most when we're talking about this is, like, you needed an understanding of yourself so that you understood, like, what you were feeling and going through. Whereas, like, the estranged parents, they use theirs as an excuse. Yeah. It's like, well, I went through this, because anybody could say she had trauma, she had a loss, she lost a kid, the accident. Anybody can say that, right? But also, you suffered through things too, and you didn't do that. Right. Like, I hear you when you were like, I wasn't a good dad, I wasn't present at the time, and then you were like, okay, so what else can I do? It's like you were fighting to always do something different without having any direction on how to do it either. And you still did it.
And I think, yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of it was also trying to find that shared experience, that community, where I kept looking to church, where I kept looking to here, where I kept looking at there, and then constantly trying to push myself into gears and systems that just, the gears just would grind, there was, it was like, it would mess for a while, and as long as I could keep the wheel going, but then as soon as I couldn't keep it up, then everything came to a crash. So understanding that I didn't need all these things to feel whole, I just needed to be true to who I am.
Yeah.
And so much of that too was, by, the threat that always comes out is, and I heard this from the time I was born, practically. It was like, well, just wait till you have kids and they do to you what you did to us.
Right.
And even now, the constant, when I have these, engage these estranged, so much of it really has been, I mean, the estranged parent community online has been a huge healing part for me, to be able to have these conversations with people who are voluntarily putting themselves out there. And, not with my mom, because I can't have these conversations in the same way with her. I can't be like, you need to say these words. But, seeing the similarities among the parents and connected with, how my mom has been, is just, and this is the part I think some of these estranged parents don't understand. It's like, you are so predictable.
Okay. Yes.
It's copy paste, copy paste, copy paste. Like, I understand that there are specifics within, but your narrative is exact every single time. And it's like, and none of these people would I want to hang out with. Like, I think that's part of it. Like, I'm an adult now. We are entering this conversation voluntarily. It's not I'm not obligated to be your friend, and especially when it's also you have the added enmeshment and the emotional incest side of that. Of
Yeah.
you're also kind of my step-in husband who then neglected me, and that's part of it. It is just the I made you this significant role in my life, and then you just abandoned that. Well, I was
Right.
never supposed to be that role,
Exactly. I see when you're commenting, and almost always I'm like commenting on the same content. And what I would say is their responses are so canned. It's
Yeah,
like you could take anybody's situation, any of the like adult children who are no contact
right.
or low contact. You could take any of our situations and insert any of us in there, and
Oh,
they would have the
100%.
same responses.
Yeah.
Half the time, they don't listen to what you said or read what you said. It's always like about inheritance and what you're going to get. Maybe we should withhold, and they're entitled. And that stuff is still so triggering even for me. So like, how are you?
My dad did the same thing. He was, a few years back, he was like, "But do you even care about our property out there?" I mean, because it was basically the conversation I was expecting to come, which was, we're just going to give it to give our stuff to the church. And it's like, you're the one that moved 2,000 miles away. Like, I have no reason to care about what your property is. Like, I don't want it. Like,
Yeah,
could I use the money? Sure. Is raising
right,
4 kids in today's economy easy? No. But I mean that's the thing that I think is doubly enraging. I've seen other people, comment on this as well. And kind of what I was trying to get at was, this well, just wait till you have kids and just wait. And so I was always waiting for the other shoe to drop.
right,
And again, in a lot of ways, I was a terrible parent. But even now, like I have 2 adult kids, 2 in high school, and I could not be happier about our relationships across the
right,
board with any of them. And I'm so happy for who they are and what they've become, and all in their own way. I mean, I think that was one of the biggest things that I realized from birth was, again, being an only child, being constantly compared. Like my mom, I think, thought very much that kids were just cookie cutter. And so she would see the best of other people and their families and assume that needed to be our family through and through, even though she was a very different person in public versus the way she was at home. She projected everything that was good about me when we were in public, but then would just hammer on me, when we were in private. So she herself never saw, there was no integrity there on those things. And I think, again, the autism is a strength in many regards in those things, because you see these patterns and you see the lack of reality, you see the lack of just objectivity of facts of anything.
yeah,
It's like, okay, you keep, and that was the part, like, I kept waiting, I think, to grow up and for these things to all click. And then, for my kids to turn around and hate me because of who I was, and I'd have to deal with that just like they did, and blah, blah, blah. And it was like, wait, I was, again, a pretty lousy parent for a very long time. And it's not that hard to love your kids. Like, I don't,
yeah,
like I
right,
don't, and they'd also, and this is what I get mad before, like as far as like, I'm not looking for a big apology, I'm not looking for anything else, I'm looking for you to be present today. And I think, again, with my own experience with my own kids, being that this has all happened within the last 2 or 3 years, but I was totally like, when I figured out the autism thing, I was excited to share that with my kids, as it wasn't like a hidden shame thing. It was like,
right,
hey, I figured out this is why what I am. And also, this might be affecting you because you're my kid, and this is, passed on. So, if you see these things in yourself, it's okay. And at the beginning, when I first, I
yeah,
had got them all individually and said, because this was right after my cousin died, and all that really came, that's what really kind of brought that focus in for me. It was just all that coming together at once, and so when I had that conversation with them, first, and they're like, oh, well, I kind of thought I was, but not. And, no. And, they kind of, no, because there's so much negative press around that word, right?
right,
But now a couple years later, they're all like, oh yeah, I am, and this is how, and this is why. And it's just it's just an open conversation now. And I think that's the biggest thing that, from birth, like I said, when the twins were born, just holding them at 2 hours old, and they were so different.
yeah,
They were completely
right,
different. They reacted to the world so different immediately. I was like, oh wait, kids are different. They're not all the same. Because even then, I mean, I was 25 years old with now 2 kids.
Yeah.
And, I was still of the mind that just like all kids are the same. You just do the same thing. Growing up in that James Dobson era of, parenting and everything else, it was just this cookie cutter thing. And so, and luckily, thankfully, I was listening to a podcast around the same time. It had nothing to do with any of this. It was just like a tech podcast. But one of the
Mhm.
things that this guy always would say was, that he wants his kid to be screwed up in their own way. And that was something that I really kind of grabbed onto and have just kind of continued to use as a guiding path, is that, and not the kids are broken or anything else. The point is that everybody's messed up in some way. They're all let them be messed up in their own way, not with my added layers on top of that, not in the way that I need them, not trying to correct who I am or who I am not, but being open about, hey, this is what's right or wrong with me. This is what I've done right or wrong. And I've never had to sit down. We've had the conversations, but I've never had to sit down and have a formal conversation with the family and be like, I know I screwed up as an alcoholic and now I'm not doing that anymore. And now, somehow I want forgiveness or something. Like, no, I
Right.
and it's not on them to forgive me for that. They don't, it's up to them to be wary of who I am or am not at any given time. Like, it's what you bring to the table today. But I also don't feel any animosity any longer now that I'm in it and have changed my behavior and have been present as a dad and done my best with them to be open about, why I did those things and why not making excuses. But again, it came down to a lot of misunderstanding of who I was. And so much of this stuff they figured out so much quicker than me. Like, I mean, them knowing their own path and things and just doing their own thing and knowing when to say no and saying no. And then you're going, man, I didn't realize you could say no. That actually makes a lot of sense. And I mean, they went no contact with my parents before I did, voluntarily. And they were never blocked from my parents or anything else. But, again, my parents didn't visit much. They would, everything again revolved around religion or whatever else. They were trying to constantly proselytize to the kids, and then the confrontation really started happening there because my mom would come in and she would basically do anything to override me or undo anything I said, in front of the
Right.
kids. So, and my oldest son is, of the neurodivergence, he's the one that's like 95% ADHD. And at that age, he was a handful. And, it was one of those things where when grandma was around, he went in full swing because he knew, he's a little mini me. So she already had that, projection on him that she had on me of, this was her chance to do better with this next one, right? So she
Yeah.
almost took him on, she took on my son as kind of her surrogate son then, and then I was still kind of in the role of her surrogate husband, and so it was this immediate power dynamic of, what she said went, and anything I did was, wrong in terms of that. So she would immediately override it. And it was like, no, you can do that. No. And then if I finally had to raise my voice to stop something from happening or someone getting damaged, literally, then it was all you do is yell at the kids, it would just push those buttons until I did. And then, I got blamed for that. But then, as soon as she would leave, again, they saw, out of 365 days a year, they would be around my family for like 4 hours and
Yeah.
then project that was the way things were all the time. And it's like, they're that way because you're here. It's like, if you got a puppy and you run in and you get all excited and they get all, waggle-tailed and pee everywhere and start barking and whatever else, like, that's not how that dog is 100% of the time. It's because
Right.
you riled it up. They're responding to you. But because of these very specific instances, my dad shows up out of the blue. Again, it's 5-hour round trips and they would visit once or twice a year. But my dad shows up out of the blue, basically opens up his checkbook and, pretty much a blank check. And he's like, whatever we got to do to, get you and Ethan help, my son, then we'll just have to, we'll pay whatever it takes to do that. And I think a lot of this was, again, like I said before, my mom saying that, trying to get me therapy, whatever else. And then her, her reverting that, well, dad didn't want to pay. It was just a money issue, blah, blah, blah. And so it was the same thing here. But again, they weren't asking questions. They weren't showing any curiosity on what was actually happening or the dynamics or steps. It was just, here, we screwed up by not wanting to spend money on you. So we'll spend money on your kids to fix you. And we were already in the process of, we already knew something was up. Like he would say things that were very outlandish and, do a lot of things that were crazy. And I was like, well, we figured out that it was because of ADHD, and got him stabilized, and he's been great since. Like, it was, and we're super close. Like, he moved out, earlier this year. He's a full grown adult. And this is what kills me when these, like, these estranged parents are like, well, wait till you have kids. Well, do you have adult kids? You don't know what this possibly can be like. And I was like, man, I got one in college, I got one moved out. And I mean, we talk more now than we ever have.
Yeah, and you didn't have to show up perfect. You just literally had to be present. You had to show up. That's it. I'm so happy that I'm talking to you because, one, I really wanted a male perspective on being an adult, estranged or.
Hey, you don't see any males having the conversation.
Yeah, I don't. I never do. That's why I reached out. I'm like, I have to hear your story. But one of the things that I love about it is, like, sometimes when people show up, they have tried so hard to be perfect. And they
Right.
really have, like, I did not struggle. I did not do this. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't do anything. I love how you're like, I messed this up a little bit. And guess what? I still have a good relationship with my kids.
Well, and kids are so resilient. I mean, and the kids want to love their parents, and they want to be loved by their parents. And I think, that's the part where, yes, lots of kids, including myself, do estrangement imperfectly, but they do it because they don't feel safe, because they don't, there's no value being added to their life there. And when it's not only not value being added, but it's also a vampire of their energy.
Yeah.
Like, why? That's not fun. I mean, and I think so many people, I think from what I see, 99% of it, and this is what I went through myself, and maybe that's, I'm projecting here, but again, with my kids, I mentioned already that they were so proactive in this, and learned their boundaries early, and were willing to say no to stuff and not do things. My oldest, ADHD, he's not great in school, he whatever else, but he's a hustler. He got out and he did his own thing, and he did it his way, and he didn't let anybody get in his way. And that's who I was as a kid. It was just beaten out of me. And so I see that, and I'm like, man, I could have had so much more success in life. And not that I'm not, but I'm saying, I could have had such an easier, more successful, time in life, just internally in my brain, if I'd been able to make those choices without the guilt layered on. And the whole religious layer of here can't be ignored, because it's the expectation of it. It's like, again, I have nothing problem with being religious, whatever. But the problem for me, and I think it's a common thing with autistics as well, that I see across the board, is that we're already working so hard to get to the baseline of life,
right.
Just to show up, that it's adding the religion layer and the sin layer and all those things is like voluntarily playing the game in advanced mode. Like, we're playing Super Mario and we're just trying to do the normal mode and just not die for 8 feet, and then when you add the religious component to it, now you put the game into advanced mode, and now we can't get anywhere, and it's like, and it's fine for you. I mean, if that advanced mode helps you enjoy life better, cool. Does not work for me.
Yeah. And, for someone who's listening, who's in a similar position, but feels sure about taking a step, what would you tell them, or what would you want them to hear from you about what they should do?
I think number one thing is that if you're working against yourself, and I think the working against yourself happens in a lot of different ways. It comes from accepting more than you know you can accept. It comes from not being willing to say no. It comes from, whether it's blatant, like drug and alcohol abuse, like what I have with the alcoholism, everything else. Like, if you're constantly doing something to feel accepted or accept yourself, you gotta find what you're doing that is not being true to yourself and who you are, because you're any of that is immediately performing for somebody else to be accepted. And if you haven't accepted who you are or found who you are, and I think that's the biggest thing. Like, it took me 40 something years to figure out that I was autistic. Accepting that is what kind of led me to accepting other parts of me and seeing where my limitations were. But I think the main thing is, if you're constantly trying to fit yourself into a cog and it's not working, then you got to back off and see, why that is. And I think a big part of that is documentation in some way, whether that's talking in communities, whether it's just writing in a journal. I'm terrible at journaling. My journaling, honestly, is debate on the internet. That's where, you see me commenting all the time because I'm able to be challenged immediately. And honestly, I know there are lots of dangers to it, but like, ChatGPT and stuff was a huge part of that. Just being able
Yeah.
to put it into something, have it reflected back, knowing what it's doing. Yeah, I think that's the hard part, is that people start engaging with it as if it's a human. But the problem is people say that, well, ChatGPT is dangerous because it reflects back to you what you want to hear. So do your friends. Like,
So right.
that's what all these estranged parents are doing, is just surrounding themselves with people who believe the same way they do. Like, it's the same thing. But knowing that, just getting that out and then having your belief challenged, I think that was, and especially for estranged parents, I mean, I think that's the biggest thing, is that so many of us, we were never able to build our own ego. We had our ego built for us. And so then we had to strip that off. And there were so many times that I had to, strip that off and rebuild, and strip it off and rebuild, and strip it off and rebuild, that, being wrong now doesn't bother me, because I know I'm wrong on stuff. Like, but it also emboldens me when I figure out where, okay, this is the logical right path to go at it 100%. And I don't try to convince anybody else of anything in that regard. Like, well, you're right or you're wrong on this. It's more, I just try to reflect back to them, hey, there's another perspective on this that you're definitely not seeing. My point there is that you have to look at what you're doing for other people and why, and then look at what you're doing for yourself and why, and then dive into that more. And I think primarily, especially for guys, and I see the patterns with pretty much any estranged mother, and where a son is involved, is where the son has become that mother's emotional support.
Right.
And I think that the main things there is to list the specifics of how you feel that way, of how you feel your emotional, you're becoming the emotional support, and then set boundaries around that, and then watch what happens, especially if you're still in it. Because I think none of us are willing to challenge those boundaries, because we're been programmed to say no for so long, and that anything but that is sin, is whatever you want to label it. And how quickly that love and caring nature changes when you put boundaries around it. And so if it's like, if I go, and usually it's the other way around, usually it's my kids going, hey, you want to go to lunch, you want to do this, whatever. But I mean, if I was to say, hey, you want to do this? And I do, you want to do this, you want to do that, whatever. And they go, no, I'd rather do this. And I go, okay. I don't take it personally. It's just like, but there is so much wrapped up in just something as simple as that, in so many of these dynamics, where, there's, well, like, if I say no to her, then this is going to happen, and that's going, and then this, and then, you're running out the scenarios in your head of what if I say no. If you're having to run out the scenarios of if you say no to somebody for anything, something's wrong.
Yes.
And so in that, I think, for me, again, autism, but I see the patterns easily. So once those patterns boil up and are crystallized, then it's very easy for me. I think for most people, even if that does come naturally to them, again, processing and documenting those patterns, writing down the observations and making them concrete. Because if you can go back and, whatever, even if it's just one thing, it's like, hey, every time I do this, my parent does that. Document it, write down, put a time and a place on it, and write down exactly what happened, because you will be gaslit so quickly after that you'll think that you're the crazy one, and then you'll go, oh, well, it must be me. And most of the time it's not, and again, setting little boundaries. It's like, if you want to call, text me and we'll set a time, because I have to be emotionally prepared for that. I can't just be called out of the blue. Again, my mom would call me 20, 25 times in a row, and, until I answered the phone, because I figured somebody died, and it was never anything. It would just, again, every conversation turns into, control and manipulation in some way. But I think the biggest thing for me is just knowing that the behavior and what is said and the promises are two completely different things.
Yeah.
Again, this is something that, really I didn't come to a conclusion on until in the past month with my mom, where she says all the things. She gets all the way up to the point of, I want to know your story. I want to, I know I was terrible in these areas. And she gets somewhat specific, but it's almost like it almost always turns around to, I'm sorry I was so good at this. And if you put out a couple specifics of anything, then it turns into, but what about this? But was this a problem? And it's all just, again, gaslighting, because it's like, well, you brought up a situation that was a positive and you said, is this a problem? Like, you're wanting me to reinforce that you did a good job, is what, it's this constant validation. And it's like, but then when we ask for validation, we're just crazy, you know?
Yeah, you can't have it, but give it to me. So
Right.
and it's like they want everything excused that they did, but they don't want to excuse the reaction.
There's no need for conversation or blame at all. And I think
Right.
that's the part, like, you know, hey, we'll talk about this for 20 minutes. We're not bringing up blame on any part, you know, and if it turns into a blame game, I'm ending the conversation.
Right.
And you know, and see if that is even a thing, but you don't have to, like, again, it's one of those things where if you have to just disappear and that's what you think is the best thing for the situation, you know, if you're using that to proactively turn it into a positive for you. And I think that was the biggest thing for me, was the fact that this, again, just like the religion layer, this was something that was just a mind suck for me that took away from my family. And I think, you know, for me, I had to stop trying to be a good child and had to start being a good ancestor, you know,
I
and
love that.
be the person that I needed. Because at the end of the day, when you're sitting there trying to be a good kid, we already know it's never going to be good enough. It's never going to be the right thing. It's never going to be the right way. And as long as you're doing that, you're immediately taking away from being a good ancestor, especially if you have kids. So, I mean,
Yeah.
just know that any time spent on trying to repair that situation, because I think that's the suck, right? That it's this, well, you're abandoning family, you're being bad at family, wait till they do this to you. Well, if you keep focusing on trying to repair the situation that may or may not ever be repaired, and you're essentially abandoning your family to do that,
Right.
yes, you're going up in the same spot. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why, you know, that's why they ended up where they are. So that's the cycle that's being broken, right? They don't want that cycle broken because it stops looking up to them. It's a pyramid scheme. It's
Yeah.
multi-level marketing.
It's genius. You know, your content is so helpful because I started this podcast because I'm estranged.
Yeah.
And what I've found is in your content is that it is such a different perspective. And, you know, it's kind of like autism's also the superpower. And I'm wondering if that's why,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's the way that you express what's happening, even in your commenting back. So, like, that is healing when you can talk about your story, when you can defend, you know, yourself or even help people see another side of it. So I think that is just so strong. And I am so thankful that we were able to talk about this because I think that it's going to be so inspiring, especially to the men who have been silenced all their lives into this point, that they can maybe tell their story or understand that they're not the only one going through something.
Yeah, for sure. And I really appreciate, I mean, once I looked into what you were doing here, and I think you have the most, what is attempting to be the most complete perspective on this. I mean, I really like the whole 3 steps and working on having that reconciliation point for the families that are open for it and everything else. Like, I mean, you really have this, you have the perspective down very well. And I appreciate that part. And on the commenting part and like my engagement on social media with this is, and that, you nailed it for me. Like, I'm definitely, I think I was in the beginning. I think in the beginning, I thought that if I had a perspective that I could reach these estranged parents in a way that would move the needle in some way.
Yeah.
And I've realized after probably thousands of interactions now that 100% of the time, that's never going to happen.
Yeah. They won't
And
budge.
even, you know, maybe someday that perspective will change, and maybe something I said maybe will come back at least as a thought, right? But now, I mean, 100% of my meaning and continuing to do it, like, I can do it in my sleep at this point. I'm not, you know, the debate isn't all that interesting for me. The reason I do it now is for other people like me who are coming into the community and finding their own way to see a balanced voice in the conversation, you
Yeah.
know, because I do my best to not get personal with the person, to not, you know, there's plenty of times I would love to say so much more, but
Yeah.
I do my best to bring it forth in a balanced way that cuts to the heart of it as much as I can without just obliterating, you know, the person, especially if they're the, you know, the actual content creator. I'm not here to like just blast people, but I am going to balance your perspective if it's plain wrong. And I do feel very strongly that this is basically, you know, much of the estranged parent community is potentially, and in many very real ways, harboring child abusers.
Yep, it
And
really is.
and so when you have if you were to put that in those terms and say, well, you know, here's this community of people who are just supporting other child molesters, like
Right.
that would not go over well. But
No.
that's, that's a sin. It's like what they're doing to get, and it's so stuck in the grief portion of the pattern, right? Like there's never any movement. You see, over and over these people stuck in that point. I just want to go, look, okay, you got through the grief part. Now move on. Let's get to the next part, because that's
Right.
when we can start doing this. Is that, grief and repair are not the same thing, right? Like
Yes.
grief is I miss you and cool, nobody cares. Repair is I
Right.
hurt you. Here's how, and here's how I'm changing.
Yeah, because 'cause we've missed them for a long time, and I think that's the part that they don't get. It's like, "I miss you, you cut me out of your life, my child hasn't talked to me in 4 years." It's like, you were never there
Right.
emotionally for us.
Yeah.
We've missed you this whole time.
Yeah.
So I hear you, and I think that they keep harping on empathy, and for us, it's like, you did not care at all about how we felt, but now you're begging for our caring, and you
Right.
think caring's gonna undo this. So repair becomes the thing. See, that's why I'm like, this is just so strong. Your perspective is going to be why somebody doesn't give up on themselves, because
Yeah.
they're like, I know that I'm not the only person, but they just can't find their community. They're going to find it in you. Be able to navigate it and set boundaries. And maybe some of them will reconcile and
For
reconnect
sure.
with their families, and others of them will be the safest they've ever been just because of your story and how you impacted them.
And I think if we had the knowledge and terms and know how of what we were doing, we could short circuit so much of this, for me 30 years ago,
Yeah.
because again, my no contact, essentially the whole estrangement story started in 1999. Like, this is not a new thing. And that's the hard part too. Like people are like, because I have been talking about this for 10 years, like some of these people have. And so it's like, well, no, I'm not a known voice here, but I've been probably doing this much longer than anybody,
Yeah.
and there are plenty of people out there that I see all the time commenting that are 60, 70 years old and in the same boat, and that's the hard part. Like, again, kind of like how I didn't want to be identified as being an alcoholic and focusing on things I haven't done. Um, I don't want to be stuck in the loop of being, the neglected child. And that's not where my focus is. Again, my focus is to give other people the terminology and knowledge, because again, I'm not sitting here, go to therapy or whatever. Because for a lot of people, therapy just isn't an option.
Yeah. I'm a therapist, so I know it's not an option
Yeah,
money-wise, and you have to find good therapists, and there's a lot of therapists that just validate. There's a lot of nuances
right.
to that too.
But there's so much power and knowledge in these communities now, that I think just finding that voice and understanding the similarities and doing it again for the right reasons of making yourself better and stronger and being able to just survive in the world. I hope it all helps. That's what I'm here
Yeah,
for.
no, it definitely does. I just wanna thank you again for being
Yep.
here today.